Welcome everybody to the RIW live studio in Livonia, Michigan. Today we are going to play some Commander. We have Jason Alt here from Brainstorm Brewery. How you doing, Jason?
I'm doing fantastic. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming. And we also have Jeff here from RIW and Brian, famous RIW member, also writing for Channel Fireball. How you doing, man?
I'm doing awesome.
So we're going to have a sweet game of Commander here for you guys in a second, but before we get into that, I wanted to do a quick deck tech of Jason's Omnath deck because this deck looked really sweet and we were talking about it and we wanted to discuss some landfall things. So let's get into it, man. What are you playing?
I'm playing Omnath Locus of Creation, one of my 4 Omnath decks, because I have all of them. I will build a 5th one when they let me. So the thing about Omnath that I really like is it lets me kind of steer into landfall, which I think is probably my favorite keyword mechanic. And one thing about this deck specifically that I wanted to highlight is Omnath Locus of Creation specifically made me kind of rethink how I feel about landfall. I used to think of myself as like an exploration deck, where you want to play Oracle of Maldaya and any effects that let you play extra lands on your turn. But what I realized is this deck specifically, but maybe all landfall decks, are kind of better to look at as burgeoning decks. The biggest difference is that a turn 1 burgeoning will let you ramp out a lot more when your opponents are always playing lands, but burgeoning will let you get landfall triggers on their turn much more easily. And that's very important with Omnath Locus of Creation, because if you don't manage to blink or bounce Omnath on your turn, you get a maximum of 3 landfall triggers. Those 3 landfall triggers are very good, but gaining 16 life in a turn cycle is usually better than, doming everybody for 4 damage. So when I started seeing myself as a burgeoning deck, I started playing a little bit different. So if you look over here, I'm running Mana Breach, which I'm not really running as a griefer card as much as I am as a card that allows me to gate my lands more easily, because you always want to have lands to play with your effects that put lands into play on your opponent's turn as well as your own turn. So if you look at, I run very little interaction. This is where I end up cutting cards most often. I start with like 10 interaction cards and just pair them back when I find cards that allow me to do sweet stuff. I tend to play, if I'm going to play counter spells, I will play them as spells that stop my opponents from disrupting my combo. I like to let people do their thing, and I like to prevent them from stopping me from doing my thing. So this is I guess, kind of pretty standard landfall stuff. But what I think specifically that I haven't seen a ton of people run in Omnath is Equilibrium. I've seen some people run Cloudstone Curio, but Equilibrium and Curio are 2 of the ways that I can get Omnath back into my hand so that I can replay him. And therefore, if you get more than 3 landfall triggers on your turn, you can start the 4 life, 5 mana, 4 life, 4 mana, 4 damage cycle all over. Equilibrium is also really good for using your creatures to get rid of their problem permanents, and it's just a cool card from back in the day that I have always liked, and I'm running it because it's my deck, and you can't stop me.
Totally fair.
Over here, we kind of have some general value stuff. Crucible of Worlds is a good value card. Panharmonicon, Temur Ascendancy, Smothering Tide that probably shouldn't be in the deck. I tell people not to play cards like that, and then I turn around and play it myself. But I think one of the all-stars of this deck is this guy over here, Retreat to Coral Helm. Now, when I started thinking of myself as a burgeoning deck, I stopped playing Mana Dorks, and I started playing Sakura Tribe Scout, Walking Atlas, that kind of stuff. This sets up a loop where if you play something like Simic Growth Chamber or any other bounce land, you can untap the Sakura Tribe Scout that put it into play and return the land to your hand and just get as many landfall triggers as you want. It's you may remember from Modern there was a deck called Nightfall that used Night of the Reliquary with Retreat to Coral Helm. Yeah. So I'm doing some of those shenanigans, which is why I play as many bounce lands as I can. We'll get to that in a bit. So over here I just, I have kind of crop rotation, growth spiral, explore, that kind of stuff. Pretty standard stuff for a landfall deck. And you'll notice I don't have Scape Shift. Scape Shift is not great with this Omnath specifically. Yeah, the red-green Omnath, run Scape Shift. But here I think Splendid Reclamation is where you want to be, just because anything that gets, your lands that get destroyed, any of your lands that get milled or discarded, and any of your fetch lands, bringing them back it can be pretty good. So I think playing Splendid Reclamation, getting 4 fetch lands back, getting your Omnath triggers, and then having those fetch lands to trigger again on an opponent's turn is more useful than just scape shifting, where you get 3 triggers off of Omnath and then nothing on anything else, unless you have Admonition Angel or Royal Elemental, both cards I play in this deck. So that's about what I wanted to talk about in this section of the deck.
You want to talk about the lands for a second? I mean, you are a landfall deck. That is pretty important.
Yeah, if you'll notice, I'm running the full complement of bounce lands. I'm running all 5 that are available in this color combination, and I'm also running Ghost Town. Ghost Town is a card that I think more landfall decks should run, but it's criminal not to play it in Omnath Locus of Creation specifically, because if you have Burgeoning or you have a Dork that puts a land into play, Omnath is going to get that gain 4 life trigger on their turn, and sometimes if I'm trying to hold up something like a Dovin's Veto or any sort of interaction, any instant speed thing that I need to play, being able to access 4 mana on their turn is important. So the bounce lands are good for setting up the loops with Retreat to Coral Helm. They're good for just always having a landfall trigger, because playing the land is less important than getting the landfall trigger. So if you just bounce Celestia Sanctuary to itself every time you play it, you're guaranteed to have a land in hand. And the deck has no trouble getting enough mana to play its spells. So it's important to make sure you have as many landfall triggers as possible. I'm playing quite a few fetch lands. I could be playing more, but I'm running Misty, Windswept Heath, Flooded Strand, Arid Mesa. I could be running more, but I don't want to cut basics, and I don't really want to cut the few utility lands I have. So I'm prioritizing running all the bounce lands over running more fetches. But I am running Prismatic Vista and Fabled Passage. And Blighted Woodland, which is controversial, but I really like how explosive that is. The Triumphs are in there, obviously. Strip Mine. I run Strip Mine because I really don't like certain other lands people play. Stuff like Homeward Path, and just any sort of land that's really griefing people, or Gaze Cradle, stuff like that. Some of that stuff needs to go away. And this deck does have a Crucible of Worlds and a Ramonep Excavator, so if Strip Mine needs to be the board police, it can do that repeatedly. Reliquary Tower is probably the most cuttable land in the deck. Reliquary Tower's fine, especially if you're drawing a bunch of extra cards, bouncing your Omnath and getting those card draw triggers, but it's probably the worst land in the deck, and if I did have to cut or replace something, Tower's probably the first thing to go.
To say, I was talking about my Shatterfang deck yesterday with Brian, and I had the same thing. It's like, well, there's a Reliquary Tower in here if you want to go off a Skull Clamp, but it's not very good, and I could definitely cut it, so I can totally see where you're coming from on that.
It's one of those Magic cards where you're like, I'm going to put Reliquary Tower in the deck because it's a deck.
Yeah. It goes in a deck, yeah, it's fair. Alright, you want to talk about the threat package here?
Yeah, absolutely. So I kind of, instead of setting it out by mana cost or whatever, I sort of have it into categories. That first category on the left there is the burgeoning creatures, I want to call them. You have the Sakura Tribe Scout, you have the Llanowar.
The Reclaimer, Sky Shroud Ranger, Llanowar Scout, yeah.
Yep. I've got everything except Walking Atlas, which I cut for Zimone, because Zimone draws you cards.
Yeah, Zimone seems like a better effect.
Yep.
Better version of the effect.
Rootraiser is a fantastic card, because it does both things you want a creature like that to do in the deck. It'll bounce the lands for you and you can replay them.
Yep.
It's very solid. I'm running the Risen Reef because I like Risen Reef.
Sure.
Not because it's always great. But sometimes you get other elementals, so you incidentally sometimes just get those re-triggers. And Coiling Oracle is another one of those cards where it's like, wow, it's a Magic deck. But I mean, drawing a card off of a creature in a deck that has, Panharmonicon, Cloudstone, Curio, and Equilibrium, and also has the Temur Sabertooth. Coiling Oracle's never really sucked. Dockside Extortionist is controversial because it's a game-breaking card, but especially in this deck where you can just set it up to generate infinite mana with Team or Saber too. It's kind of dirty. But I also think that if I don't really tutor for it and I only get it maybe 1/5 of the games I play, it's not that bad. And maybe I'm just rationalizing playing a card that I tell people not to play. I think some of the stuff is.
I think on the dockside note, it's pretty contextual because it is probably one of the best 5 cards in Commander, something like that. But
yeah,
if everybody's playing with cards of that power level, it's totally reasonable. It's just a powerful card. It's not game winning by itself. You need to do something else game winning to actually win after playing it. So, it's a powerful card, but everyone's doing powerful stuff. I think it's fine.
I've generated as much treasure with some other cards before, so
sure.
It's just one of those cards. So some of this stuff looks pretty standard. So I don't want to waste everyone's time talking about why I run Lotus Cobra in a landfall deck.
Sure.
But some of the stuff that I think I see less often that maybe I want to talk about, it's worth mentioning. I really like Thieving Skydiver a lot. I will tend to play Thieving Skydiver for 3 mana on turn 2 when I can, because there is almost always going to be a Soul Ring to take. If you have 4 players, people just get turn 1 Soul Rings. Taking Mana Rocks is very good. If you think about the board state as a 0-sum game, taking a Mana Rock from them and using it for yourself is a 2-point Mana Rock swing in your favor.
Yep.
So taking their stuff is better than playing your own thing or blowing it up. And Skydiver is bounceable in this deck. You have lots of ways to return Skydiver in your hand, so it actually does a ton of work. I had Sower Temptation, but that was cut for space.
Sure.
But Skydiver it's fine late, but it does so much work early that I think in a deck where you're bouncing a lot, that's super worth it. Cosima is a card I don't see many people run. Cosima is a card that I have basically taken out Rhystic Study and replaced it with Cosima in a lot of my landfall decks because it routinely draws 6 or 7 cards.
Sure.
Especially if you get it down early, send it on a voyage, and then it comes into play as a big fat creature, which is non-trivial.
See, are you playing it mostly on the front side, or do you use the back side?
I've never used the back side.
Okay, so almost always is the 2/4.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I built the deck. I built a mono blue Cosima deck that does some of the same shenanigans, like Retreat to Coral Helm with Walking Atlas, which is fun.
Sure.
But it's fun to steal their lands, but in this deck, I have only cast the front half of it. Knowing the back half exists is cool, but it has no evasion, and it's the only vehicle, and it's not super great, but it's fun.
Definitely.
Another card I don't see it run a ton is Royal Elemental, and it's getting run more lately. I think it's more fun than Admonition Angel. And if you do have a big turn where you can't do anything with your Omnath anymore because you already had 3 landfall triggers, you don't care if you have Royal Elemental out because you're going to have a big turn and steal a bunch of stuff. It is, it's just a second Admonition Angel and arguably much better. Now there's one more card that I don't really see anybody play, and that is the Moonfolk there. The Soratami, yeah. Now, a lot of those Moonfolk from Kamigawa block have been rediscovered as really solid landfall cards. Just being able to pick up land or put land into play like the Patron does. I don't have the Patron in this deck anymore, but I do run in other landfall decks just because if your hand gets gummed up with lands, it's nice to be able to put those into play.
Sure.
But a 7-drop creature doesn't really help you out early, so ended up getting cut here. All the stuff that costs more than 4 mana in this deck better be pretty powerful. And Phylath, Avenger of Zendikar, and Deadeye Navigator, they're definitely worth paying all that mana. But this runs a lot more like a combo deck, where your big turn is just either getting those Omnath, Locust, or Rage triggers, or just drawing a ton of cards and gaining so much life that your life total is out of reach. if you get a nice loop going where you have a burgeoning and like a ghost town or something like that, you can gain 8, 12, 16 life per turn cycle, and it puts the game out of reach. And then all of a sudden they have to kill your commander damage.
Yep.
And being able to equilibrium their commander so it can't kill you, and that sort of thing, gives you inevitability. I don't have a ton of ways to stop them from blowing my stuff up, so if I'm relying on Validate, Recovery, and Eternal Witness, usually I'm either in bad shape or I'm so far ahead that I can kind of spend a few turns dirtling to get set back up and try to go off again.
Sure.
So, this isn't I top deck Escape Shift and win the game deck, because that kind of bored me when the deck played like that. I like it a lot more as sort of an incidental, you just get a ton of value, and Omnath letting you get value on their turn is kind of what taught me that I wanted to feel like a burgeoning deck. And if you kind of look at some of the cards that are missing, like Oracle of Moldiah and cards like that let you play extra turns. I don't think I have a Wayward Swordtooth either. They are kind of less necessary when really what you want to be doing is getting landfall triggers when they do.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's really interesting that you've taken it this direction, because I think a lot of people see landfall, and you're right, they do think Oracle of Moldiah, they do think Wayward Swordtooth, but I mean, your just conscious decision of playing creatures that put lands into play on opponents' turns makes a lot of sense when you're capped out of 3 land zones. So I really like what you've done with it, and I'm really excited to battle with this. So, ready to take us on?
Yeah. Can I ask a question?
Sure, go for it. What do we got?
So, if you were sitting down with this particular build of this deck to a game where you didn't know anybody in the game, and you did the rule 0 thing, how would you describe the power level of this deck?
Well, as some people know, I kind of invented the 75% EDH deck theory, where I kind of said 75% is sort of between like kind of a half-assed casual or pre-con deck and something that's going full tilt. Over the years I've written, I've sort of pared 75% down to I like variance a little bit more. I think you don't have to cut powerful cards like Dockside and Smothering Tide if you introduce variance and have that limit how the deck plays.
By variance, are you meaning like tutors?
Yeah, I kind of think you'll occasionally draw a Dockside Extortionist, but not drawing it every game means you're not a Dockside Extortionist deck. You're a deck that can benefit from whatever card you draw. So a lot of the infrastructure of the deck is just set up to whatever land I draw, I'm going to get a benefit from playing that land based on what I have in play versus the cards that I draw specifically matter more. Which is again why I don't want to rely on having to draw something like Escape Shift. In a deck like this, any creature I play gives me a trigger on Cloudstoke Hero.
Sure.
So in 75% deck building, it's actually designed to play against people whose decks you don't know. So you're not going to make somebody with a pre-con miserable, but you're not going to be completely pub stomped by someone who's a little more tuned. So everybody says their deck is a 7.
That seems accurate, yeah.
But I think mine's a 7.5, and I tend to build all my decks kind of the same way. So it does have powerful cards, and some of those cards are maybe a little controversial, but it doesn't shy away from them because I think you're not going to get them every game, and you're not built around them. You're not a deck where when you draw Dockside Extortionist, it turns your whole deck on. It's just a card that gives you some value, and you're just as happy to see a Dockside when all you need is an Equilibrium trigger as you are anything else in the deck.
Sure. Well, all right. Any more questions before we want to get into this? No? Good.
Can I ask another one?
Go for it, yeah. What do we got?
I haven't played Commander very much since before the pandemic, so I'm kind of just like learning quite a bit.
Sure.
The one thing I've noticed, I've been looking at the decks, like the deck I'm going to be playing today, and the deck Zach's playing, and now your deck, and I noticed not a lot of removal.
Yeah.
Is that normal? Is that sort of how the format is trending? Like you just play a couple of really versatile removal spells and just do your own thing?
It's the first thing I cut.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of disciples of the command zone theory, you're like you want to run this much card draw, this much removal and interaction. I tend to start that way, but anytime I want to run a pet card, I will cut from removal. It's not the best idea, but the way this deck specifically plays, I think stopping them from doing their thing is less fun, especially in a webcam game where people don't really want to win. They want something cool to happen. So if I would rather lose the game to my opponent doing something cool, than win the game sometimes. Mm-hmm. So, as much as it's important to run removal, if something really problematic sticks, being able to deal with like a turn grid or one of those must deal with cards. So I'm sort of like a lamprey latching onto the pod and be like, wow, you guys better deal with that turn grid while I'm over here.
Yeah.
Just like, man, someone should deal with this as I'm just getting a bunch of landfall triggers and dirtling. So the way I specifically tend to play EDH, I will add the right number of removal, and then I'll be like, I will cut Beast Within to run a pet card, and that's not correct, but I don't care, I guess. So maybe it's bad advice, but this is how I like to play EDH, and another thing I found when I started exploring 75% deck building is the first decks I analyzed were the ones I'd already built before I even really thought about that as a deck building ethos. And something I noticed was I tended to cut from the removal first, and it let people do their thing, and it gave me more slots to do my own thing.
Good philosophy. I like that.
Yeah, definitely. I think I feel like every EDH deck needs like one or two pieces of removal. Like you gotta have one or maybe two ways to interact, but you definitely don't want a lot of it. You don't want to be doing a lot of interaction because you want to be doing your own thing. You want to be doing something fun too. So I'm with you on it. And
I don't like. See, this is a controversial card here, Cyclonic Rift, also, because I feel like there are cards that sort of just add 15 minutes to a game, and I don't love that. I don't even really like board sweepers per se. Like Wrath of God, I'm like, oh, okay. Which is why it's a problem I have so many one-toughness creatures and I'm just going to get spanked by a Meat Hook Massacre. But that's just my own personal philosophy, and I don't think that's correct for the game.
Sure.
So there are definitely some opinions I have that I realize it's just how I like to play versus how I think the format should be played.
Definitely.
I think that's a great approach to it, is playing. Let me think about how I want to say this. It really is a format that you can personalize your play experience in, and if you're not doing that, you're missing the best part.
Yeah.
It's not like you're playing in a PTQ where you need to win every round. Like, it's more about the play. So, playing less removal, less interaction to give people more room to actually play the game, I think is a really cool approach. That's cool.
And I'm glad you asked about that, because I think it's important when you create content to have caveats like that. Like, I don't necessarily think this is correct. If you were someone new to EDH and you looked at my deck list and you're like, Jason runs a Swords of Plowshares and that's it, like, maybe removal's not that important. And I think there's definitely a place for removal. I think that places other people's decks, but I think the pod should have removal, but if I can get away with not being the one that runs it, I think that's fine. So, as a content creator, I have been careful to not codify my bias as law for the format. So, this is specifically the way I build, but maybe some more removal will be appropriate. Maybe Beast Within is better in this deck than Psych Rift, because you can solve problems. You can give yourself a blocker in a pinch, and you don't add 15 minutes to the game. But I have played Cyclonic Rift as single spot removal on problem permanents enough times, and I've kicked it and then immediately won the game enough times that I think how it's used matters too.
Sure. Well, all right. I think that's enough for the deck. Let's get into the game and let's see how these play out against some actual competition.
All right.
You guys ready to play?
I'm
Let's
ready
do
to
it.
play.
All right.